inside of my Plonk, I want to write a custom GitHub service that will make HTTP calls for me. And I will place the code for that service inside of a new file because script.js is getting a little long in the tooth. The code scrolls off the bottom of the screen. Things will be much easier if I just create this in a separate file called github.js. I'll add that to the project, and I need to make sure that inside of index.html, I include this script so the JavaScript code inside will actually execute. Give me a reference to github.js, and I want to make sure that this script is included after script.js because it is script.js that defines the module for the application. I know that defines the module for the application because it has the second parameter, which is an empty array. You might remember from a couple modules ago that describes the dependencies for this module. We don't have any explicit dependencies. That's why it's an empty array, but I need a reference to that same module so that I can register my custom service in that module and make it available. So over in github.js, I will create an IFI just to give me some scope so that I won't create any globals. And then I'll create a variable called module, and I'll say, "Dear Angular, please give me a reference to GitHub viewer." There's no second parameter here because I'm not trying to create a module. All I'm trying to do is get a reference to an existing module that was defined before this script file came along. So give me a reference to that module. That will allow me to register my service. But how do I create my service? I could actually put this above the module. Well, you might remember from the introduction of this course that we talked about a design pattern where I could have a function that gets invoked that returns an object with an API. That was the revealing module design pattern. So someone invokes this GitHub function. It's going to be Angular that invokes it. I'm going to return an object that is the GitHub service. What I return will represent the public API. But what I will build first are the implementation details. I know this service has to do two things. It has to get a user, and it has to get the repositories for a user. And in order to do either of those things, it's going to need the HTTP service. So yes, a service can have a dependency on another service. So my GitHub service requires the HTTP service. That will allow me to do things like get a user. So I'm thinking if you call get user, you will pass in a username. And what I will do is make the HTTP call to get the data. Now this function is still going to be asynchronous. So what I need to return from this method is a promise, because in the controller, when it gets a user, that's inherently an asynchronous operation. I cannot return you any data from get user until I have talked to the server and the server has responded with some data. So ultimately, the code inside of our controller is not going to change a lot. It's still going to call something to get a user, and then it needs a .then method for a promise that will deliver the value when we have that information. Let me copy this line of code that calls http.get on the user URL, and I'm going to put that into get user after a return statement. So if this is all I did and I registered this service with the name of GitHub, someone could call this function and still do a .then and pass in a function that gets the HTTP response, because what I'm returning is the promise that is given to me by http.get. But I can do one better than this, because inside of the controller, once it calls that URL and it says .then on user complete, one of the things that onUserComplete has to do is look at the raw HTTP response and dig the data out of that response. I can actually perform that in my service so that the controller doesn't have to. So back in my service, instead of returning this directly, I will say http.get, then here is a function that takes a response, and what I want you to return is response.data. Now there's something happening here which isn't immediately obvious, and I'll admit it can be completely mind-bending until you get used to this particular programming paradigm. But what will happen when someone calls get user is that I will make a call to http.get, and that will return a promise. I will call .then on that promise so that when that HTTP call is complete, it will call my function passing in a response, and I will dig out the data to that response. And then I will return response.data. The not immediately obvious part is that when you return something from a function that is invoked by .then, and this something could be a number, could be an object, could be a string, whatever you return will be wrapped by .then into another promise that is given back to the caller. So whoever calls get user, they're going to get back a promise that will deliver the value that this return statement provides, response.data. They're not getting back a promise that will be complete when the HTTP call is complete. They're getting back a promise that represents the completion of HTTP and this particular function that digs out the data. If it's not immediately obvious how that is working, that's okay. It didn't make sense to me for a little bit. I had to work at it a while, but hopefully you'll see that the results are very simple, and it's going to be very simple to call this method. We won't actually have to change much inside of the controller, but I am going to follow the same basic pattern for get repos without an E, which will get the repositories for a user. So you pass me a user object, and I will figure out how to get the repositories. Again, let me borrow some code from onUsersComplete, copy that call, and paste it here, because I still need to do an http.get, this time not against scope.user, but just against the user parameter that is passed to me. I'm still going to return a promise, but not the http.get promise. I will return the promise that I will return this, which is response.data again. So processing that response so the controller doesn't have to. And that is everything I need to do for the private implementation details of this service. Now I just need to pick the public API, which can be very simple. I want something called getUser, which we'll call that getUser function, and something called getRepos, which we'll call the getRepos function. And now my service definition is complete. All I need to do is register this service with Angular so that other components can use it. Now, I will warn you, there's about 24 different ways to register and configure a service with Angular. If you go into the documentation, it's very confusing, but I will give you the one simple, straightforward way to register a service with Angular, and that is to use a method called factory. With the factory method, what you do is you pass in the name of your service. In this case, it's going to be GitHub, and then you pass in something that points to a function that returns an object with the API that you want. So now when any controller or anything else inside of this application says, give me something called GitHub, they will get back this object, something that they can call .getUser and .getRepos. I've implemented that service here. I have registered that service with Angular here. The only thing I need to do to use it is here inside of main controller, I no longer need the HTTP service. I need the GitHub service. I just ask for it by name. And now we have to fix up the code in here to use that. Let's start at the top. When the user clicks search, I don't want to call http.get. I want to call github.getUser. Here is the username to fetch. And then either call onUserComplete or onError. OnUserComplete has to change just a little bit. It's up here at the top. Instead of getting a raw HTTP response, we're doing that processing here. What it will get instead is the user data. So this is simplified a little bit. Just give me the data, and scope.user will be that data. Now instead of calling http.get, here I can also say github.getRepos, pass in scope.user. That will call this function, ultimately. And I can still use my promise to say onRepos or onError, and onRepos will change just like onUserComplete changed. I get the raw data, just set scope.repos equal to that data. So the code inside of the controller hasn't changed tremendously. It's not like we took out 50% of the code inside of the controller, but it has been simplified. And if you think about it, now we have this service, this GitHub service that manages the URLs, that manages the response processing. I can reuse it from other components inside of the application. And if I ever need to add additional features like making authenticated calls or caching of the data that comes back, I can add that to the GitHub service and it's just available everywhere. So I'm in a much better situation. And this is typically what I do in real applications. I never make HTTP calls directly from inside of a controller or inside of a model. I usually encapsulate all that server communication inside of a service. It makes it easier to use. It's much easier to see that I'm getting repositories or that I'm getting a user than it is trying to read through a URL and figuring out what is happening. But having said all that, we should probably check the preview window to make sure this works. And I'm hopeful, because it is displaying Angular information, if I refresh, and let's go back to Rob Connery, if I can beat the timer, which I did, It looks like I now have a GitHub service, and that GitHub service is working from my controller.